Good evening, everybody. Welcome to another take with better audio. Hoshin Kanri Business Operating System of the Future, recorded for the Hoshin Masterclass. My attempt to give this presentation earlier today was an abject failure. So we'll try it again. This presentation, as I said, was given several years ago in Italy, and I am going to give it again today. This is a painting by Umberto Baccioni called The Dynamism of a Cyclist. It's actually a sketch. And when I chose the slide, I chose it to engage my audience, which was all Italian. I asked them, I'm told you love speed. So do I. Would you like to speed up your organizations? Because that's what this talk is going to be about. How much faster would you like to go? Would you like to speed up your organization by, say, a factor of 2? Perhaps a factor of 5, 10, even 20? Well, you've come to the right place. Growing up, I was taught to love speed. This is a picture of my father's automobile. He bought it when my brother was 16. I was but 9. But when I turned 16, this was the car that I got to drive around. He held on to the car for about 10 years. We thought this was normal. It's a very nice normal. I can still remember it, and who could forget it? It's a 1958 Corvette with a very large V8 engine and a speedometer that touched 160, although we never pushed it that far. Although I was permitted to drive this car from the time of my 16th birthday, I was never arrested. I figured that the local police in my very small Midwestern town thought that I was my father, a medical doctor racing to the hospital to save lives. That was my illusion. Those were the glory days, and the glory days of General Motors. And as we used to say in my country, what's good for GM is good for America. I mention GM because, as we know, there is a new kid on the block, and that would be Toyota. How did Toyota do it? How did Toyota overtake first Ford and finally GM? Let's do a comparison. This is in the early 2000s. On the left, we're going to look at a few statistics from Toyota, and on the right, from GM. This is the number of line stops, and I don't mean hard line stops. This was every time an operator pushed the "and on" button to ask for help during a single shift during the launch of a new Lexus. That's a very big number. 10 years has passed since I gave this talk. The number of stops, according to Mike Rother, the father of the Toyota Kata phenomenon, he says the actual number on a normal day is a mere 1,000. This, in the early 2000s, was a comparable number of line stops at General Motors. And the same article assured us that General Motors managers were working very hard to get that number to go down. I mention these statistics to make a comparison about the attitude between a Toyota and a General Motors. General Motors is looking at line stops as defects. Toyota is looking at line stops as opportunities to prevent defects from occurring again. This is a completely different perspective, and I'd like to point out that it is a perspective of management. Because in a company that is tightly controlled by managers who pretty much think they know it all, you're going to get 5 line stops per day, or shift actually, instead of 2,500. We'll come back to this comparison as we look at how it is that Toyota's system won over GM's. It's a hard thing to grasp. to think of line stops as something that you might want to encourage, certainly during the launch of a new vehicle. But daily, 1,000 of them a day, 1,000 of them a shift. Toyota only has about 3,000 people in the plant, so 2,500 is like that's one per operator. It's a very large number. The answer to this question, why would Toyota do this, I think takes us really into the heart of Hoshin Kanri. So here we have a picture of a compass and something else symbolizing some kind of stability or true north, if you will, at the center, the gyroscope. So the word Hoshin is composed of two Chinese characters, Ho and Shin. Ho means method or form. Shin means shining needle or compass. Taken together, Hoshin means a methodology for setting strategic direction. The word Kanri means to manage or to execute. It can also mean control. The term quality control in Japanese uses Kanri as the control word. So in a sense, we have strategy control in the case of Hoshin Kanri and quality control in the case of total quality management. They're very closely connected. In fact, Hoshin Kanri is a Japanese addition to the practice of quality control, or quality Kanri, if you will. Many of you may be familiar with Hoshin Kanri in one form or another. Italy's own Roberto Galgano wrote about Hoshin in the late 1980s. The balanced scorecard, the term coined by Harvard Business School's Robert Kaplan and his co-author David Norton, is derived from Hoshin Kanri. The breakthrough strategy of Six Sigma is also derived from Hoshin Kanri. And the structure of many of the world's productivity and quality prizes also have their origins here. Now, why a handshake? A handshake represents the process of building consensus or building buy-in. And I'm reminded by a statement by President Dwight D. Eisenhower, who was Supreme Commander of the Allied forces during World War II, said of planning for the Normandy invasion, "Plans are nothing. Planning is everything." He was speaking of all the negotiations that led up to the consensus upon which that successful operation was based, and he was rightfully famous for pulling that coalition of nations together. Hoshin is essentially a process of building agreements to solve shared problems, executing those agreements in a systematic way, and finally remembering how to do it better the next time. And Hoshin is the mainspring of learning in the modern learning organization. A quick review of the Hoshin process. We have senior management responsible for vision and strategies. We have middle management responsible for tactics, and I'll go backward. Sorry, if I can. Some of these flows got automated years ago, so we'll go back. Oh. Here we go. I won't redo this, so you'll have to put up with it. So we have these three things. Let's just stop it there. If we look at it at the raw slide, we have vision and strategy deployed to middle management, implemented by teams, what I've called action teams in my book, Hoshin Kanri for the Lean Enterprise, and then a review process. And there is a discussion, which I call, well, actually, it is Mike Rother who called it the Toyota Kata. It's not the Toyota Kata, it's the improvement kata, and many companies use it. Toyota did not invent it. And it's a discussion about targets and means. Another way to say that is results and means. This is the core of the balanced scorecard that Kaplan and Norton discovered when they looked at Hoshin in the late 80s. So we have a company that is glued together by a dialogue, by this negotiation, if we go back one slide, by agreements, which end up being enforceable agreements. And it's an ongoing conversation about results, typically financial results, and the means to achieve them. Vision and strategies, tactics, the how, and resources, plus action and schedules. This cycle becomes extremely important in the Hoshin organization because, as we'll see later, the institution of Hoshin Kanri replaces what we know today as management accounting, which includes budgets and the internal audit. All right, let's move on to this picture, which is worth looking at. And so Hoshin can be looked at as a modified Deming cycle of PDCA. And the modification is in the addition of a fifth phase that I have called scan. So here we are scanning the horizon, perhaps on the Pacific. It looks like the Atlantic coast. I'm more familiar with the Pacific at this point in my life. In the scan phase of Hoshin, the company identifies its own strengths and weaknesses, opportunities and threats. And there are many methods that I would like to talk about. Too many. I think I'll move on to plan. We're going to look at 3 or 4 types of planning. One is long-term, which could be 5 to 100 years. The Japanese companies love the long-term view. Midterm strategy, which tends to deal with 3 to 5 years. And then the annual Hoshin or short-term strategy, dealing with the next 12 months. And the process by which all of that is deployed. Instead of budgeting, we're going to deploy the policy using catchball. So we'll be discussing how that works. The plan phase of Hoshin begins with the development of targets, including a mission that defines what the business is, why you're in there, why you're in that business, a vision that communicates to the world how good you want to be, and a long-term plan that identifies your target markets and product offerings. By long-term, we mean anything longer than 5 years. However, as economist John Maynard Keynes said once, in the long run, we are all dead. So we're going to move on to midterm strategy. And this is what we're going to use the X matrix to table. Here we have a picture of a medical center planning. Down here we see the financial results in dollars. A profit and loss statement that's been scrubbed of unnecessary allocations to give us a pretty clear picture of cash flow and how we might adjust those. Over here we have some strategic themes that correspond to the elements of the balanced scorecard, which you see over here on the right of the X, the customer improvement measures, the process improvement measures, and the measures of the growth of people and technology. At the top of the matrix, we see a list of A3s, or a list of initiatives that will be undertaken to make a difference in the measures to the right of the X so that we can get the money at the bottom. Notice that we can also, in this case, this is the Park-Nicollet X matrix. At the bottom, you see unique patients served down here. We could put measures of mortality or morbidity, which we could manage with the same level of urgency as the monetary measures, although in most instances it's money that wins out. Here is our A3 document. As I mentioned earlier today when I attempted to give this presentation, I'm now referring to this as a relative performance contract to avoid some flack that I've been getting from ex-Toyota people. And in an effort to bring the discipline of Hoshin Kanri into the management accounting literature, where I think it may need to live, but that's another discussion. You are all familiar with how the A3 or relative performance contract is structured. Most of it is devoted to plan. The implementation planning piece is devoted to do. And finally, check and act, are dealt with in the last or the sixth block. The function of this document is to factor problems. We'll come back to that. To break problems down so that more people may become involved in helping to move the company toward its new strategic position. This is a topic that I've taken up in the rewrite of Hoshin Kanri for the Lean Enterprise, is a more mathematical discussion around true north and the whole idea of strategic positioning, which will be the discussion of another Hoshin masterclass in the future. Now, the deployment of the strategy is a big deal. This is the piece that will eventually replace budgeting, because each of the A3s contains financial information. All of the financial information in the budget should be contained in your A3 as you deploy downward. Typically, many organizations jump over that minor detail, but it should carry all the same target information that you would find in the annual budget, coupled with the information needed to get to those targets, and that's the information around the house. So the what information will be the budgetary information, plus anything else like reductions in morbidity, mortality, increases in unique patients served that are going to really be what you're going to shoot for, plus all the information around the methodologies and the technologies, and I would add the capital resources required to get there. And so down we go. We deploy down the management hierarchy to the very front line. Okay. Catchball itself would make an excellent topic for discussion. I touch on it here only. Now, why? Why does it have this structure? So let's begin with the assumption that I think it really hasn't yet soaked in to many Western heads. The new normal is that everything is governed by standard work. This includes production work, whether it be in services or in manufacturing. It also includes the standardization of administrative processes. So that, now, the big deal about standards is it makes everything measurable. Without standards, you cannot measure a deviation, and therefore improvement is impossible. I am paraphrasing, of course, Taiichi Ohno and all of the statisticians who taught him. So here we see standard work, which is coupled with this idea of continuous improvement. So you have the small, continuous, incremental improvement, which is the meaning of the word Kaizen, which is sort of your normal. Now, this assumes that the company already has some kind of standard or direction. So it's moving in a direction as a result of all of the promulgation of standards. Now, as we move into Hoshin, we move away from the Kaizen incremental improvement idea to one that is really informed by the concept of Kaikaku. These are the step changes or the big changes. So, Hoshin is there to shift the company's course by introducing big changes and communicating those to the entire organization. Now, your work might be left out. Maybe you're still stuck doing the same standard work with small incremental improvements because as part of a system, we count on you to do your job. Meanwhile, Betty and Sam, they're over in product development, are going to completely tear everything up and do something brand new because we have to get better at product development. So this is the idea of strategic focus. It doesn't mean that everybody has a big change in their work when you do a Hoshin. It means you target the big changes in order to move the organization as a system in the right direction. And next year, we'll do it again. And after each adjustment, we try to stabilize the whole system with standard work, including, of course, standard tasks, standard sequence, standard time, standard work in process, and standard documentation. Okay. Here we have the check process, and as you can see, the checking flows up. Deployment flowed down, and the checking process flows up. The process of catchball is used in two ways. First, it's used to deploy the new strategy, because as top managers introduce a new strategic direction, they will say, look, guys, this is what we want to go. This is what we want to do. This is where we want to go. And these are the targets that we feel that we need to meet financially and in other ways. And now we open it up to a conversation, which is essentially the same conversation we see ritualized with the improvement kata of Mike Rother. And they have the same sources in training within industry and total quality management. Toyota did not invent the kata. It came from America and was really internalized by the Japanese in a way that Western managers have yet to do. All right. So this whole checking process, by the way, has many dimensions, one of which is the periodic review meetings that you might associate with my book. In addition, I think you have to look at the stop the line process as a moment in the Hoshin system, or the greater system. We could talk about what we want to call it. John Shook calls it the A3 process, a term that I really dislike a lot. Others have called it the PDCA management. I used to call it lean management. I think what I'd like to call it in the future is MBM management, or management by means, again, to bring it into the mainstream accounting literature, but that probably could use a healthy debate. So the checking process follows the deployment process, and the core of both processes is catchball. The meetings are short. Here's one of the little videos that got broken in translation. The idea is that each manager gets 7 minutes to make his report on his A3. Likewise, the managers are constrained to only 7 minutes of feedback. And those of you who have participated in this process are familiar, A, with how different it is, and B, how much work you can get done. And the key to success is to hold the conversations about how to solve the problems, to schedule those with the right people in the room, rather than engaging the whole company in a discussion about the problems that Sam and Betty are having over there in product development. If it's not on your A3, we don't discuss it. And please come to your meeting with your countermeasures in place. We'd like to hear how well you're doing and see how proactive you are. Everything then in the act phase is documented in the Book of Knowledge. And this is going to be my segue to the next section of the presentation. What we're really talking about throughout the discussion of Hoshin is the institution of a new information processing structure. Now, there are two names for this. In the organizational learning literature, this structure would be recognized as a double loop learning structure. Single loop learning, which is associated with military command and control systems, is very good at getting things done, very bad at remembering, very bad at changing how they do things, because there's no learning about learning about learning. Double loop learning inserts additional learning loops as we get closer to reality. The other name that this has is decentralization. And the rest of the talk is going to deal with information processing structure, Therefore, you're all feeling disoriented, and I thought the top would be fun to look at. So that's Hoshin in a nutshell. Because when the talk was given 10 years ago, I could not assume that people knew what it was. And so I wanted to give them an idea about Hoshin Kanri as a process before I talked about its real significance, which is as a new information processing structure. So why talk about information processing structures? And why on earth look at an organizational chart for General Motors circa January 3, 1921? Well, the reason is that in this period from 1919 to 1921, General Motors reinvented the universe of business. They moved away from the traditional completely centralized management hierarchy based upon the Prussian military model and invented something very, very new. They divisionalized the corporation. You can see here's Olds Motor, GMC, we have Cadillac, we have Chevrolet, we have a tractor division, Buick, and who else? Look at all these other guys. So each division had once been a company, a private company, in a holding company run by Alfred Sloan, the president up here. Excuse me. And what he did was he made his divisions, he made them independent. Now, in order to keep them under control, he invented the modern corporate financial staff, which is quite healthy. He gave the people over here in the operations staff the ability to run their own divisions. But he kept them under control with something we know today as management accounting. Now, what you just saw disappear was Henry Ford's River Rouge plant. The management structure that we saw on the previous page was so powerful that in less than 10 years, Ford almost went bankrupt. And they were both using the same production system. And the reason is the accounting system. So we have an accounting system which is created in order to support this decentralization of control. And the accounting system consists of their two major features. One is the annual budgeting cycle and the communication of financial targets. The second feature is the internal audit. Now, when we hear the word audit, we probably think of the Great Depression, we think of legal requirements, we think of government regulations. Wrong. The internal audit was an internal audit. It had nothing to do with Wall Street. That came 10 years after the invention of the internal audit, or the reinvention of the internal audit by Sloan. And many accountants don't know this history. But the reason that it worked, is that Sloan was right to assume that the divisional managers would wander off into the weeds if they didn't have some powerful system of control. What he got, though, he was able to free his divisional leaders at the same time making them financially accountable. And he was very successful financially. Let's take a deeper look at what he did. He created a system. Now, this picture, by the way, comes from an article called Beyond Budgets by two authors, Hope and Fraser, who are huge advocates of getting rid of your budgets and replacing them with two things. One, a rolling forecast on the one hand, and something they call a relative performance contract. So what replaces the relative, so what does the relative performance contract, or the A3 as I will argue, what does that replace? Well, it goes back to Sloan. He made an agreement with his divisional managers that they would bring in the money. That's the fixed performance contract. They're going to perform financially. because we've given them targets through our budgeting process. And the internal audits hold them accountable. And again, keep in mind, this precedes the imposition of external audits by the SEC, by the quarterly guidance numbers. All of that infrastructure happens after Roosevelt takes the White House in the wake of the Great Depression. I will make one comment. Hope and Fraser referred to this as a centralized decision-making system that ignores market feedback. That probably is not exactly correct, because General Motors was very good, much better than Ford, which was completely centralized, like a military operation, like a 19th century military operation. And General Motors was far less centralized. But as we will see, General Motors is now the new Ford. So we want to talk about how that happened. So think of organizations as large computers. Economists have been doing this for 70 years. In fact, economists helped to invent the modern computer. One of the principal contributors being Johnny von Neumann, who also helped us invent the atomic bomb and the H-bomb and systems thinking. And von Neumann has his fingerprints on many early and seminal inventions of the 20th century. So, up until 2004, when you bought a PC, you bought a computer that had one central processor, a CPU, a central processing unit. And that's changed now. Most of our computers have several processing units. In 2004, Intel, after failing to overcome the efficiency problems associated with trying to run everything through a single processor. If you remember, the laptops were blowing up on planes because those central processing units would overheat. In 2004, Intel threw up its hands, gave up, and said, we have to go parallel. And I think within a year, Apple had incorporated the duo-core processor in its laptops, and now everybody has multiple cores. We don't think of CPUs anymore. We refer to these as cores, and of course, the more is better. And why is that? They're faster. They're faster and more efficient. You get higher speeds, lower cost. And the laptops don't normally blow up in your lap anymore. Now, why would that be? So here we have what some people refer to as the von Neumann architecture. I'm not entirely clear that von Neumann invented it, but that little bus, the little bridge between all of your data and your program and the CPU, is called a bus, and that's a bottleneck. It's called the von Neumann bottleneck. And let me stop this again. Okay. Because this is worth talking about. That bus becomes a picture of Henry Ford, because this is why Ford failed. Is that he was at the bottleneck. He forced all decisions to come to him, and he was brilliant until he became global. And so once he had a global operation, and he had, rubber trees in Malaysia, the whole 9 yards. It was too much for him, and General Motors was able to make decisions much faster. Now, so long as Ford was in charge, he was giving them any color they wanted, so long as it was black. It was a huge contribution to society, and he was instrumental in he was a pioneer of the living wage, for which his rich friends never forgave him. Sloan had a very different idea. He said, We will make a car for every purse and purpose. And of course, this was at the beginning of the Roaring '20s. Guess who won? He who could bring out yellow Cadillacs with ginormous engines and leather seats and produce something like a Ford Model T but with a bigger engine was going to win. By the way, Ford had this information. His son Edsel was telling him, Dad, we need to bring out a Model A with a bigger engine. We need to compete with Chevy. We need to offer options. We need to do things different. But Henry ignored his son. He was in control. I don't know why. In any case, it is well recognized that it was the structure of GM that permitted it to do this and make money at the same time. Ford was turning out black Model Ts, and by 1929 had run the show into the ground. The sales of Model Ts peaked, and that beautiful plant, that iconic plant, had been opened in 1927. Ford had to close it in 1928 in order to retool for the Model A, and he was in financial difficulties for decades after that. Okay, that's the story of Ford and GM. Fascinating story. Now, what's different? What happened to General Motors? Why did General Motors end up in the same sorry state as Ford? So here we have many cores. So it's normal for a laptop to have 4 to 8 cores. Supercomputers have many, many more. Watson has about 2,880 cores or so. They may be threads, so I need a computer guy in the room to tell us the difference. But as I understand it, cores are physical processors, but because of a special Intel technology called threading, they can simulate additional cores on the physical cores, and we call those threads. The idea is you're decentralizing or parallelizing the processing. Now, why bother? Why would you give up on the central processing unit? So here we have a picture of something called Amdahl's law, which is a rule, and here's the math, which I will explain briefly. This is one of the rules, the most conservative of the rules that people here in Oregon at Intel use when they're designing chips. How much faster can we get the things to go, and how much more efficient will they be? How can we keep these things cool? So S means speed up. How much faster can we make it go? That's what S stands for. And C stands for how much centralization must we put up with? So this is the measure of how centralized or how non-parallel your processing may still be. Now, assuming that we don't have any parallelization or any decentralization, think of Ford, who never got it together until 1948, shortly before he died. He never sped up. But if we were to decentralize by 50%, Amdahl's law says you'll be twice as fast. If you can decentralize by 75%, leaving only 25% centralized, you can speed up by a factor of 4. And so on, and so on. These are pretty hefty numbers. If you think of what we know in Lean, we know the direct relationship of timeliness and cost. So we can begin to understand if the Toyota system really is a system of decentralization, which I most wholeheartedly believe that it is. This begins to explain everything we know about lead time reduction and cost reduction, and also why quality improves as well. Okay, now let's take another look at this from the accounting perspective. This, again, is information from the Hope and Fraser article, Who Needs Budgets, in the Harvard Business Review. The new system that they describe, they never mention Toyota. Their Paragon is a European company. Pardon me, I'm going to power through this. And let's see. I'm going to take a short break and bring back some water. There we are. All right. So in the new system, the rolling forecasts replace the annual budget. For those of you who are interested, I can direct you to one of the last pages in Yoji Akao's first book on Hoshin Kanri. Akao was instrumental in the promulgation of Hoshin in Japan. And the Japanese knew that you didn't need a budget once you put Hoshin in place. And they knew this. I don't know how long ago they knew it, but in 1990, they published a book which was really it was a collection of case studies. Many companies, all of the leading companies had adopted Hoshin as part of their TQM implementations, and most of them knew that they needed to let go of budgeting. And there's actually some guidelines on how to do that. It's the very last page of the book. Now, what is MBM? MBM is management by means. This is the balanced scorecard idea, the true north idea, where you're going to look at how you get there as well as where you're going financially. It replaces management by results, which is the cold, hard financial approach. MBR is associated with Alfred Sloan and the General Motors system. MBM is associated with Toyota. So the Toyota approach, the Japanese approach, is going to replace the standard that was set by General Motors in 1919. By the way, the whole idea of return on investment was also actually that came from DuPont, but DuPont owned a large chunk of General Motors, and Alfred Sloan was using the ROI concept, aided and abetted by his owners at DuPont. So ROI is also part of the MBR construct, which is another reason that I called ROK something different, but never mind. So true north, and you can look at this from from our perspective, we would say true north, having a true north, understanding the how of your business is going to replace the cold-hearted profit maximization approach where money is the only measure of success. Now, something is going to replace that fixed contract. Hope and Fraser of the Harvard Business article refer to them as relative performance contracts. It's my observation that the relative performance contract in the Toyota universe is the A3. So let's look at some of the elements of that relative performance contract. Meaning, we're going to pay you for getting better. We're not going to pay you to hit your numbers and take you out and shoot you if you don't. We're going to pay you to get better. That's the idea. That's why they call it the relative performance contract. The targets are relative to push employees to outdo themselves. The rewards are based upon relative performance, and they give people the confidence to take risks. Continuous planning focuses people on value creation. Resources are reallocated on demand to optimize cost, and decision-making is by local units in touch with one another to make full sense of the market feedback. Meanwhile, the budget is being revised in real time as conditions change. This language does not come from Toyota. This language comes from the accounting profession. And in the end, the accountants are going to win. If in case you didn't know that. Another reason to maybe shift this Hoshin onto a better accounting foundation. For those interested, you can read my 2 articles in cost management. Finally, we get, and this is my addition, that catchball or the kata and stop the line really are going to supplant. They're not going to replace the internal audit. I think that the accounting profession is too entrenched to make that happen. But we're going to overplant or supplant catchball on the kata, and eventually our new healthy tree of Hoshin will metabolize the audit. And here is the comparison of the fixed performance universe versus the relative performance universe. This is one of perhaps the core message in the beyond budgeting literature. This is really what they want to see happen. The budget, the annual budget, is just this relic that is more like a fence that keeps everybody cooped up in the fixed performance contract, rather than liberating them to do something different. Now, a moment of peace, a moment of silence, for General Motors, which went bankrupt in the year that I gave this talk. I did not plan on it, but it did. And then moving on. I think those of you who heard my presentation earlier today, my barely audible and painfully inaudible presentation, I'm going to give you 2 examples of successful decentralization. Perhaps my favorite, because it's so glamorous, is Porsche. I joked today that to my chagrin, I found about 6 tall, blonde, good-looking Porsche consultants sitting in the front row, because, in fact, the president of Porsche Consulting, which is the leading consulting company in Europe, gave a talk that preceded mine. So I had some trepidation about giving this example, but really one of the best examples of the power of radical decentralization. And this is the term that Pope and Fraser use. They say our new organizations are radically decentralized. That appeared in their 2003 article. I mention it because if you have read the articles on agile, you will see the same phrase, radical decentralization. So the accountants know that this is the term, and also the agile people know that radical decentralization. They're dealing with organizational structure. Now, why am I talking about? There's a long tradition in economics about information processing structures. Again, computers and organizations, we think of them as being more or less the same thing. And again, I have to back up to tell pardon me. There we are. We'll back up one. Never automate your PowerPoint slides. You think you pull it out and you haven't. So back to Toyota. Toyota was on the verge of bankruptcy, 1993. They bring in Shingijutsu. It must have been an extremely humiliating experience for them. But they went back to school. And they're now launching electronic cars at the same price point as the Tesla S. And you know what? It's sexier, and I want one. They're going to win. They've learned how to, they are major, they don't just make sports cars. Of course, they do that beautifully, but they have entered all these markets based upon what Shingijutsu taught them about product development on the one hand, and of course, how to make cars, how to actually fabricate the cars. And another dimension, they learned how to manage their supply chain of very strong-minded, highly talented German engineers, and of course Swiss and Italian as well. How did they do that? Well, it was Hoshin. Not only did they learn Little's Law and value stream mapping and all those wonderful things, they glued it together with Hoshin. And they did it in a way that allowed them to drop their product development lead times to less than half. It normally would take them 7 years to make a new automobile from the ground up. In the year that they went live with lean production, they rolled out the Boxster, and the next year they rolled out a new 911, and the development lead time for both new cars was only 3 years. And on the production line, the cars rolled off without defects. No rework, something that had never happened in Porsche's history. They later spun off their Kaizen promotion office, and that is Porsche Consulting, now perhaps the leading consulting company in Europe. Okay. Next miracle of radical decentralization. So when did this happen? Let me look at my notes. In February 1, 1997, a fire destroyed the factory of Aisin Seiki, a very important plant, actually a key plant in Toyota's supply chain. And Toyota only had one day's worth of stock from the Aisin Seiki plant. They couldn't produce Camrys. Within, of course, all the Western media said this is the end of Toyota. Let's say goodbye. There's no way they're ever going to come back from this. Within hours, 62 firms responded to a call for help. Within 2 days, the first prototypes for Aisin Seiki's part had been delivered to Toyota. Volume production of the missing valve began to ramp up on the 4th of February, and by February 6th, this is 5 days later, Toyota was able to resume volume production of its automobiles. So 5 days. Only in a supply chain integrated with Hoshin and with a great deal of trust and transparency would this be able to happen. Again, a miracle. I cannot see it happening without Hoshin Kanri. This is not just a miracle of simple lean manufacturing and cell design. This is a feat of let's have our entire supply chain solve the problem. We have multiple cores. Now, why didn't we think of this earlier? What held us back? Well, let's go back to Intel. Why did Intel wait until 2004 to cease putting money into the design of faster, better central processing units? Well, the answer is it's really hard to program parallel computers. We've known about parallel processing certainly since the 60s when we saw the first supercomputers. You might remember the Cray supercomputers. Those things are hard to program. When you bought a Cray supercomputer, you also got in the box, they shipped an engineer. You got the machine and you got the engineer who lived with you. The engineer moved in because to program these machines required a very high degree of expertise. Now, I'm joking, but only partially. The engineer probably made the machine run physically, kept it from overheating. I'm not sure what his programming skills were, but these things were notoriously difficult to program. Now, experts will point out there are 4 or 5 things you have to do. Number 1, you pick the right problems. Not every problem can be given to a parallel. You don't need to have a parallel processor work on simple problems. So you have to have really difficult problems to make it worthwhile. Now, once you get a hold of one of these difficult problems, and many of today's quality problems are meet the criteria. Certainly, the problems of healthcare are very complicated and meet this criteria. If we look at organizations like big computers. So what do you do then? Let's say we have a problem like the problem of discharge. How are we going to solve the problem of discharge? Well, you're going to break it down. You're going to factor the problem, to break it down into small chunks so that when you distribute the problem solving across multiple cores or multiple decision makers or multiple departments or multiple empowered employees, the problem will make sense. You will deploy the factored problem to the department, to the team, to the individual, and they will be able to make sense of the targets. They will understand what you want them to do, and they will have some idea of how to do it. It's comprehensible in terms of what and how. Now, let me back up again. The other things you have to do, you have to ensure that we have we have a good communication system. All of the information processors have to have a way to communicate with each other. They have to coordinate their problem solving, which is point number 3. They have to synchronize or coordinate their problem solving. So you have to break the problems down. You have to communicate in order to synchronize the problem solving. And the last thing you have to do is that you have to manage the interdependencies. Okay. So how do we factor the problems? Enter the A3. We factor the problems with the A3s. We break the problem down into problem statement, target statement, analysis, proposed action, implementation plan, and check and act. This is all about making the problem comprehensible in terms of the whats and the hows. How do we communicate? Well, this is my joking way of talking about the kata. We have 2 conscious individuals capable of reason. We open up a channel of communication. The sensei has a target, communicates the target. The grasshopper has a way to get it done, communicates the means. They confirm that they're on the same page, and off we go. This is really the function of the kata. And the theory on top of the Greek statues is just basic communication theory. Now, how do we manage the interdependencies? Or how do we synchronize? This diagram, which I've drawn multiple times, which now is partly the basis of the agile structure of Rona. I first saw this diagram in a book called Fast Cycle Time by Christopher Mayer, another Harvard guy. When we build our Hoshin, we think in terms of these units. So here the vertical column, which I've labeled here as functional managers. In Rona, these are our practice groups. So we have Lean Ops, we have Hoshin, we have GAPIT, we have Quality and Patient Safety, and we have 3P. And who knows what else we'll create moving forward as we find new specialties. And here we have, over here, I have value stream managers and the chief engineer, but here we have really what we have are our executives, our regions, north and south, our executive leads, and our system of executive and engagement leads. And we field teams from the different specialties. So putting it all together, so here we have my admonition to my audience in Italy: don't be a Henry. Very, very admirable person in many, many ways. A real human being with also many flaws. But his his micromanagement was probably one of the least pleasant things about him from a business perspective. So we really would want to adopt a bit of a different attitude. Many people in America growing up still aspire to be managers in the cut from the cloth of Henry Ford. A successful entrepreneur, gets to run his life, visionary, all of this. There are many things people still admire about Ford, but one of them that we really need to give up on is the idea of centralizing control. And understand that consciousness is something that even rocks and flowers participate in, like the Buddha would teach. Everything is in the nature of consciousness. So a philosophical moment. Moving on. As leaders, we need to think about how we can grow this consciousness, both in terms of its adoption by the organization and also specifically using the A3s not only to factor problems, but to set up coaching relationships to make sure that our managers understand the new culture, don't aspire to become Henry or perhaps Elon, and take it from there. Next point, we have to count the money differently. This really does require a change in our accounting systems. Management accounting is dead. Long live management accounting. The budgeting process and the internal audit, particularly the audits that are conducted in order to, quote unquote, hold people accountable in a punitive way, that has to give way to the open-ended dialogue of catchball, the improvement kata, and the relative performance contract, paying people to get better rather than paying people to make a slam dunk. Finally, we're all going to need patience. Now, naive me, Ritzko pointed out to me that this is actually a Chinese tea ceremony. I was, for years, I thought it was Japanese, and she pointed out in her inimitable, kind way, helping me not feel quite such an idiot. But the point is, you're going to need lots of patience for this to happen. It doesn't happen overnight. So here come the, I have to make the bicyclists come. So we end where we began. Do you like speed? And how much faster do you want to go? Excuse me again. This is the completed painting, The Dynamism of the Cyclist by Umberto Boccioni. I've forgotten where it hangs. I'll get back to you with that. But the idea that Hoshin is really such a new thing, and very dynamic, but also not simple. Cubism isn't simple. This is a cubist painting. It really breaks our perspective. I like Cubism because it is what it shares with Hoshin. Is the idea that there's more than one way to look at things, and that the thing itself, the actual dynamism, if we're not just looking at the cyclist, we're looking at the dynamism of the cyclist. It's these different perspectives. You can imagine, the cyclist going by, threading his way through a crowd of 100 people. There are going to be 100 different perspectives on that cyclist and his dynamism. And I think this is what Boccioni has captured for us. We get, in a way, a deeper appreciation for what's actually happening, which is pulled together, despite the multiple perspectives. We pull it together in a meaningful way, and in this case, a very moving way. Hoshin does this as well. It gives us this slightly fractured, factored cubist view of the world, but it makes us more dynamic, speeding us up by factors of 2, 4, 5, 10, 20, Who knows what the limit is? And thank you for putting up with my cough. I'm sure this is a damn sight better than the presentation I made earlier today. Thank you.